Right, we're good to go, everyone. Welcome to this BAC talk session on the exciting world of immersive technologies, VR, AR, MR, XR. We've got a great panel today. Let me introduce them. On the top right, well, I'm not sure actually if you see it that way, the way I see it, but we have Gabe Paez. He is founder and CEO of The Wild, the global leader in immersive collaboration software for the AAC industry. Wild Technology owns and operates The Wild and Iris VR, a recent acquisition, which enables professionals to work together in augmented reality and virtual reality from anywhere in the world. Prior to Wild Technology, Gabe designed and developed immersive software, products, and experiences for a diverse roster of companies, including Google, Samsung, Nike, and AT&T. Also joining us is Andrew Wade Keating, AIA, an adjunct instructor at the BAC and partner in Boston-based multidisciplinary office Stack Plus Company. He began his work on interactive and immersive spaces with Master in Architecture and Thesis Research at the Harvard GSD and continues as a participant in the SciArc Edge Center for Advanced Studies in Architecture. His research focuses on the potentials of virtual environments and the application of architectural thinking in virtual space making. Also joining us is Kat Schneider. She is a digital design application specialist with IA, Interior Architects, not AI, adjunct instructor at the BAC, and co-founder of Kindred XR. Largely focused on visualization, her experience as a designer, creative technologist, and maker has led to deep research and experimentation in the world of VR, AR, and XR. She has worked with a broad range of clients to build immersive experiences across commercial real estate development, hospitality, commercial interiors, edtech, and fintech. My name is Anthony Froster Robledo. I am an architect and editor of Architosh, a 21-year-old publication focused on CAD, AEC, and 3D industries and their evolving digital natures. I'm a practicing architect and associate principal with the Boston area firm Morehouse McDonald and Associates. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We have an exciting session. Let's get into it. We have a lot to talk about today. Gabe, Kat, and Andrew have much to share. Hopefully this will be a lively discussion, and I look forward to the questions at the end. I want to open by framing this technology against a statement. This is the Palmer lucky moment. Let's go back to the moment in the first half of the last decade when Chris Dixon of legendary Valley VC firm Andreessen Horowitz says this: "I've only seen a handful of technology demos in my life that made me feel like the world was about to change. Apple II, the Macintosh, Netscape, Google, the iPhone, and now the Oculus Rift." Okay, Gabe, let's begin with you. You are on the supply side of the industry. Is Chris Dixon right? Is it really that big? How do you see immersive technologies transforming us in the long run? Why is now the VR moment?
So I absolutely agree. I think that not just virtual reality, but immersive computing. So the whole suite of technologies that add up to the very big idea, which is to put the person at the center of the computing experience rather than a device. So for years, we've been accustomed to technology being something that we have to go look down at or sit at a desk and stare into. But we're on the verge of a paradigm shift right now, which is transforming the way we interact with technology from being something that we have to go to and exist on its terms to something that just lives amongst us and around us and is a part of our everyday life and how we experience the world physically. And that paradigm shift, I think, not only is it transformative, but I think it's important, to be honest. You know, for years now, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone to say that our experience with technology has felt a little bit troubled. We have these lives now that are largely sedentary, largely built around technologies that we experience sitting hunched over and so forth. And we've just come to accept that that's the way that technology works. You know, as a designer, as an engineer, I do my work, my deep thinking work, sitting at a desk or at a conference room table. But is that really the best that humanity can do? Is that really the best that we can do as people? I would say no. Like, we need to get back to where we were a generation before technology, which is people activated, moving around, using their hands, walking around, interfacing with spaces, environments, and other people in a way that is fundamentally so much more human than how we interact with each other now via technology. And to me, that's really the transformational piece that immersive computing presents, and the promise of all of this technology is to create technology that is so much more natural than what we're accustomed to. And by doing that, and this is the big thing that founded why I founded The Wild initially in 2017 was to do that, not just to activate people individually, but to connect them in ways that we just cannot connect via social networks or chat applications or all of these different ways that we connect online. Even video conferencing like we're doing now. I want people to be connected as we do in physical spaces, and especially for this industry, the buildings industry, I would say we understand this better than anyone. That's why we build environments, so that we have a forum for people to come together and experience that space and those people in a way that just feels good. And this is where these technologies and these ideas converge. Let's take people, places, and ideas and put them all together in a virtual space where they can congregate just like we do in the physical world. And that's why I'm so excited about this technology and the promise that it holds, not just for this industry, but really for humanity.
That's great. So what you're really talking about too is ergonomics. You're talking about human ergonomics and its relationship to health.
Yeah, absolutely. Health's a big part of it. Being active, being engaged, even though my job is intellectual and thinking, and I don't work with my hands, but really, we should be working with our hands, all of us, especially builders. Somebody designing a space, that's a fundamentally physical act. And I think this return to the idea of the architect as a builder, physically activating and making these spaces happen with their physical bodies is just a different way to think about our work and a different way to live our daily lives, which I believe will feel better than honestly what we're doing right now.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent. Gabe, I know you have some visuals you want to show our audience. Can you load those now and we can walk through those?
Sure. So I just wanted to give a little background. So my company, The Wild, basically Wild Technology creates two product lines. One, which is The Wild, and this is a software built for designers and engineers to come together from wherever they are on whatever their device. So not just virtual reality headsets, which is maybe what you came to this talk expecting, but on a regular desktop or laptop computer, or on an iOS device using augmented reality, which basically, like you're seeing here, you look through the device and it basically takes your BIM model or your virtual content and lays it into the physical environment that you're at. So The Wild is great because it allows all of these different devices to cross-play and people to connect on each of these devices using a common language, which is the immersive space itself. Inside, you can review and do like a design review inside of your model. You can explore that space just as you would physically, but you can also actually activate and manipulate the space in time, whether you want to move furniture around, move walls around, mass out new ideas, or so forth. We also recently acquired Iris VR, which is one of the forerunners in this technology using virtual reality for the buildings industry, and really allows you to do so much with a BIM model, exploring that BIM model, tracking issues inside of it, making section planes within the space, really allowing you to activate that model as you would expect to do in Revit or Rhino, whatever you're using, Navisworks, but immersively. in a space with all of your different stakeholders on the project. So there's so much that's possible here. You know, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over, but it's you know, I just want your mind to sort of open up in terms of what we can do through both of these products.
Right, right. And last time we spoke for an interview on Architosh, you were talking to me about the COVID pandemic and how that had changed the nature of work and how the feedback you were getting from many of your users in the workplace was inspirational for thinking about the future of work. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that may have impacted the tours feature, which I think it's worth maybe mentioning what tours is like and what it can do for workflows?
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing around the pandemic was it instantly exposed the entire world to what remote work is, and both the good parts and the problems with remote work. And you know, I really believe in the foundational idea that we should be able not just to work from home, but to be able to work from anywhere, to really break down these barriers of I need to live in this city or in this neighborhood to have this job, but rather to allow you to be physically and socially activated in whatever community you want, but be able to connect to the work that you want to do and that you're most qualified to do. And this is really the promise of what the future workplace that we really champion promotes, which is to say, I can be physically anywhere and I can join with my team immersively inside of the wild or inside of Iris VR and feel like we're working together in the same space. And so that's really a shifting mindset of what we expect from collaboration software, but also what we expect from the workplace. What it means for people to come together and do work together. And is it required that they're physically co-located in the same space, that we're flying or driving and commuting into a building so that we can work effectively together? Or can we do better than that? Can we create, by virtualizing that transportation process of moving people from place to place, can we actually make it so much more efficient for us to work together, so much more accessible for us to work together? And also in doing that, make it so much more powerful to work together, because we're not just sitting in conference rooms looking at screens of 2D plans, but we're walking the building together, just like we would expect to in the final form. Once everything was done and all the money was spent, let's do that when it's in the idea stage, because we have that power now. You know, we have the ability to be able to co-locate inside of that experience and truly or that space and truly experience it together from idea through construction.
Right, and that definitely changes the nature of how design professionals are working with their clients. Clearly, during the pandemic year, they couldn't reach their clients. Everyone was locked in, as they say. Kat, I know you do a lot of work at your firm, pushing the edge of what's possible with immersive technologies. Can you talk to me a little bit about your pandemic year and what that looked like for your practice, and paint a broad brush, if you will, of how your firm is sort of working with collaboration now and what you learned during the pandemic year?
Definitely. I think, you know, we weren't immune to really the upheaval and kind of reinterpretation of what our process was. Last March, we, in the span of about 3 days, went from, you know, being in offices and having charrettes with pen and paper and markup boards to having to figure out how we collaborate effectively when we're not in the same space. We do use the wild internally, and I think what it has opened up for us is the conversation around virtual placemaking and whether or not that is a realm that we as interior architects need to step into. And over the course of the last year, what we've really been doing in practice is launching a new service line of our firm called IAXR, which is leveraging our expertise of workplace and combining it with the expertise we have in VR in order to establish a take on what virtual space should or should not be. And so it's been a year of exploring by testing on ourselves how effective VR could be for collaboration and for design, which is so inherently three-dimensional. It's really been invaluable in terms of not just being able to look at or spectate a space, but being able to formulate your responses or criticisms of an environment by actually just being in it together as a team. So it's definitely been an interesting year, but I think all of the stars are really starting to line up for VR to really be on display for what it's best at, which is exciting to see after years of kind of promoting it, but not necessarily having it gain the traction we always knew it would get eventually.
Right. The some of your company's blog posts on VR are quite fascinating, and perhaps maybe we can launch into some of your visuals so that we can talk a little bit about your work.
Definitely. Let me do that. All right. There we go. Let me know if you can see my screen.
And by visual workplace making, are you also talking about designing virtual environments for the purpose of entering them in a virtual way?
Yes.
To be together and to work together. That's kind of designing conference-like spaces, designing spaces for co-working. Is that correct?
Definitely. So what we're recognizing is that we would be remiss as a firm that focuses on workplace to skip out on the virtual realm, which is quickly taking hold as another form of a conference room that you might walk into physically with a coworker. And so it's been a year-long sort of exploration in figuring out what it means to be virtual designers, as well as designing for physical space, and also the convergence of the two. How do you establish presence when you've got a mix of folks attending virtually and physically in a space? Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So I have a little synopsis of what our experience has been, and in the intro it was mentioned that I do teach at the BAC. I co-teach with Kachina Studer, and big shout out to our students who are on the maiden voyage of taking what was a VR class in person and turning it into a virtual VR class dispersed across a couple of countries in addition to the States. And so this is the formula we had originally followed. We were in person. Folks were kind of learning by doing, workshop format at the BAC. When we were asked if we would be willing to teach the class remote, we sort of looked at each other and said, why wouldn't we do this remotely? In theory, we should be able to, but we weren't necessarily convinced that the best way to do that was through Zoom. And so having used the Wild at work, we decided we would take the second half of the class and teach VR in VR and have our students revisit design models that they had done in previous studios and sort of repurpose them and breathe new life into them as a virtual context instead. And so what we typically find is that we're teaching VR in sort of two verticals, one being the technical, which anyone that is joining us today that has created in VR knows that there are technical implications and limitations that you just have to design around in order to not be sort of stopped by them. So one is sort of the optimization of models, which are very rich in their complexity. We also were very fortunate to have each student receive an Oculus Quest for the duration of our class, which greatly helped our ability to run the course. And we spent a decent amount of time really unpacking materials because there's sort of a realism that needs to be brought to VR in certain cases in order to make those experiences shine. And then the second portion, which really contributes to how long you want to stay in VR, is the experiential side of things. So how are you creating an experience that is more than just putting someone in your virtual space, through sound, through interactions that you're using, and also kind of defining these mechanics. This is a little graphic that just depicts how people focus on particular things in a field of view. So really trying to unpack as designers how we leverage each square inch of visual space to direct people around an experience. And the last sort of goal of the class is really to make sure that our students are prepared to go out and be that VR person at an architecture firm. So this is how I'm using it in practice right now. This is the Wild. This is a space that we put together to take clients and new users in and teach them about this new world of VR and what it could mean for them. And so this is a couple of examples of what we're doing in practice. So that's virtual me on my boss's couch in a virtual environment that is tabletop style. He's looking at me through an iPad, and I am leading him through a tour on a device that he already has, which is the iPad. And we're able to sort of walk around the space as if we were together. He and I are speaking, and I'm pointing out certain aspects of the environment. The desktop experience or the VR experience is similar to that. So this is that same showroom space, but being viewed a little bit more immersively, less AR, more VR. That is my virtual self again. And what we're able to do in this space, which was really an exploration at first and led to how we approach other virtual design projects, is to look at all of the tools that we have available to us in the wild and figure out how we kind of exploit them to make engaging experiences. So we're walking through the floor plan in VR of the space we're in. It gets very meta very quickly in VR. We're also able to do things like experiment with materials live. So for any folks that are using real-time rendering engines, it's an entirely different experience to be inside of the space, just seeing the impact of those changes live. But then there's also these fundamental aspects of how we do work that help us get the work done, like these virtual pin-up walls, which can now include 3D content. So you'll see me sort of scale up a chair and just be able to sit down in it if that's what I want to do. And then I'll skip ahead a little bit here. But there's all of these formats that you can take within VR and with this unique tool set that allow you to really work together as if you're standing side by side.
Wow, that's really amazing.
Yeah, it's been interesting to look at. So this is a mock-up of a VR experience, and it's our Austin office. And so what's been interesting is over the course of the last year at work, we've had internal and external events that would have taken place in person take place virtually. And so that sort of opened up this whole new realm of what we design. And then in the context of the coursework, this is what our students created. So a really rich set of designed experiences. I think when we first set out, one thing we reiterated is it's really not enough to take someone and just airlift them into your project. What are you doing while you're in a virtual space? And how do you design an interaction that proves the point? So you're not having to say, this corridor could be a playful area where people can play with this installation. You're allowing them to do so in the presentation and kind of bringing them along that journey. And then here are some other examples of their work, but these are our student-led final products that we were very proud of, in just seeing them really experiment with what their unique take on VR for design was.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And I saw also in one of your blog posts on VR on your company webpage, you used the term empathy engine, which I thought was very interesting to describe the VR experience, I think. And can you kind of unpack what you mean by that a little bit?
Yes, definitely. I think there's so many different experiences, mostly cinematic experiences that exist in VR where you're putting yourself literally in somebody else's shoes. And that's sort of case A for the empathy engine. I think what I've seen on the practice side, and it's also played out in our workshop class as well, is that by putting somebody in the space and bringing them on the journey with you and allowing them to really test out the functionality of the space from within it, you're opening up an entirely different conversation. I think a lot of times the traditional medium for the AEC industry relies a lot on interpretation, and VR really takes interpretation out of the equation. You're allowed to sort of react to things in real time. And I think for us, it helps us connect on an even deeper level with our clients. I know for me, it helped me connect even better with our students, because if I didn't understand something, we could just jump in and mark it up together. So you're not relying on everyone's ability to imagine three-dimensionally. You can just immerse them in it directly.
Right. So do you feel that VR allows you to get more connected to the intentionality of what your students may be thinking? I ask that because, strength and representational skills in architecture schools can vary quite a bit. And they can be quite seductive, and seduction is kind of aimed at biasing. And so I always think of the architect Aldo Rossi, who was sort of belittled on some level for his childlike drawings, which actually were remarkably beautiful. But he had very powerful architectural concepts, and he just wasn't very good at drawing, perhaps. And so I think about representational skills in students, not just hand skills these days, more computational skills. And what you're suggesting is that VR can get you closer to the intentionality, or to get more aligned with what they're thinking.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the tools have come an incredibly long way, particularly in the last couple of years, the content creation side of what you can accomplish in VR. We see it playing out in things like Rec Room, which is much more of a game, less workplace application, but being able to model things directly in the wild. There's also a platform called Gravity Sketch, which effectively lets folks model with their hands what they may not know how to model in Rhino. So it's been interesting to see folks play around with what they can do in there. I remember early days in my career, I showed my boss at the time a VR headset, and she told me she had no interest in putting it on until it was as easy for her to create things in there as it was for her to pick up a pen and draw. She was a phenomenally talented drawer, so it was a little bit different, but I really do feel like we're approaching that point where the barrier to entry, you don't necessarily need to be a developer who has X amount of years of experience or really know your way around Grasshopper to create some very parametric and organically formed complex geometry just with the facility of your hands. So I do think it limits the distance you have to go to articulate your ideas digitally.
Right, being able to paint with your hands is pretty powerful. It kind of takes us back to when we were children and we did, finger painting, and that how expressive that was. And speaking of expression, Andrew's work has gone in very interesting conceptual directions with VR. He's explored the concept of space making and despatialization concepts. Andrew, I'd love to bring up your content here and talk to you a little bit about it.
Sure. Yes, I can jump into the content. Part of what I'm interested in is just picking up on what Kat was saying about the kind of power inherent in virtual space and how we can make virtual spaces in and of themselves the focus and make them operative, and not so much also, as you said, Anthony, kind of a representation of a physical space, but how the virtual space can be the the space with which we're concerned. And that's kind of where my focus is if you think of sort of every piece of quote unquote kinetic architecture that you may have seen or may have been conceptualized, it's almost freeing architecture from the physical constraints that limit it in order to think about, okay, how operative could architecture be as a kind of a tool and a discipline that is liberated from the virtual space. So as much as I agree very much with Gabe's sentiments about kind of architect as maker and kind of really getting a grip on the work and working with one's hands, I actually think it's precisely the ability to free an architectural construct from physical constraints that is where the power comes from. And suddenly a kinetic work of architecture is very much kinetic as it operates as a work of virtual architecture. And so one of the other things I'm very concerned with is kind of the role of architects as we begin to create virtual space. So I'll bring up some of this content here. So I'm particularly, can you see my,
yes.
So I'm particularly focused on the art space as kind of one area. If we think about the wild without being at all reductive as a kind of a virtual space in which we operate on physical buildings or other types of collaboration that relate to, let's get together and collaborate on what will be a physical building. I think about all the other types of spaces for which we could create a virtual a version. And for me, the art space is where a lot of my research has focused. So I go back to kind of 25,000 years ago to Chauvet Cave. And I look at the fact that the relationship between space making, or defining the Chauvet Cave as a space, as an architectural space, even if it's a found space, the relationship between that and art making goes back 25, 30,000 years. And that kind of role of architecture as it relates to art making, but also curation of art and the display of art, is a sort of fundamental. It doesn't begin with sort of museum and gallery expression. It begins with examples like Chauvet. So as art making starts to move into the digital realm with things like tilt brush paintings, I think about how the architecture that supports it must evolve. And when I say that, I'm really thinking of a virtual architecture, perhaps, that will be useful in curating. There's very little doubt that a brick and mortar gallery or museum space is not the optimum means of displaying a tilt brush painting. And then when we look at other forms of media, this is In the Eyes of the Animal by Marshmallow Laser Feast, where we have sort of fully immersive works of art. This is not going on the wall of a gallery or even in the round in a museum. And so we start to think about, as architects, even video pieces that have been around for some time, how best to display a video piece or motion graphics in the conventional structures of art. The art world and brick and mortar museums and so forth is not clear. And so, even out there, we start to get into AI assisted image making and think about how there's just a lot of new media that's digital in nature and is sort of contextless and spaceless as it relates to the physical realm. So I worry about architects losing their agency in this equation. And the idea that, I have this thing about net art, which is if where the museum is going is we're all clicking through 2D images of artwork on a 2D net art type format, architects, we have a big problem. Architecture has lost its agency in that equation. We are no longer creating spaces in which the art it can be displayed. And so some of my work on this is sort of these more radical takes on, for example, taking tilt brush paintings or digital artwork and placing them inside a virtual environment, and then using a process I call dynamic curation, where you as the user are interacting with an interface, you're selecting different curation parameters, and as you select these curation parameters, or artificial intelligence assists you with curating the artwork, you're then kind of digitally, dynamically curating your own experience. And then this is another take where basically each work of art inhabits a voxel. And as you select different curation parameters, the voxels reorganize themselves into a kind of architectural construct. And then you're able to sort of access the artwork from within these voxels. And then another scheme where the museum or the virtual space kind of builds itself chunk by chunk based on the types of curation parameters that you might select as a user. So you might say, I would like to see another work of art made by this artist, and the next piece of the museum or gallery or virtual display space kind of instantiates itself. And so, really, it's the kind of how the power of virtual space as a kind of operative construct that is, just as valuable as physical space. And these virtual spaces become part of our reality and a kind of extension of our landscape.
Right, excellent. That's very fascinating. So if architecture loses its agency in terms of how we experience art, it's not just art. We're talking about architecture losing its agency in other kinds of subjects inside of architecture, like theater, dance, retail. It's very interesting because, let's take retail, for example. Some brands use architecture as a messaging service. I'm thinking of Apple in that case, right? Do you think there's a role for architects in reinstating architecture's importance in this virtual realm? Is that where you are kind of headed in your thinking, that there's an opportunity here? It's not just a negative for architects. There is a positive that's in front of us as well.
Without a doubt, and really, people are making these virtual environments now, right, everywhere. And we look at motion graphics and particularly entertainment and video game environments, and architects need to jump into that space. I mean, I think as architects, we believe that a certain approach to the creation of space that involves thoughtful synthesis of different contexts and criteria, we sort of believe that we have a unique training, and our discipline is sort of we sort of think we are who should be in charge of making spaces, and so I think that there's this is not about kind of doom and gloom. This is a sort of a call to architects to jump into this space. Let's create a virtual environment that is architectonic, but I mean that in the way of as thoughtful, as smart as the way architects approach physical space. I would frankly like to see some of the conventional architectonic ideas that are so prevalent, the same forms that we recycle over and again as architects in the physical world. I would like to see some of those fall away. So when I say architectonic, I don't mean it looks like what I saw on ArcDaily this morning. Radically different, far from it. And I think VR provides that opportunity.
Interesting. Gabe, when you created this tool a while, did you have any idea the directions it could possibly go in the hands of someone like Andrew Keating?
Yes and no. I mean, I say yes in that I felt like any good tool it's not just the idea of the creator of that tool that makes it wonderful. It's the users of the tool really are what makes it magical and wonderful. You create a capability, you create constructs that create a different way for an artist to think. But in the hand of the artist, it's really where the tool shines.
Right.
And so I do believe, though, in a lot of what Andrew is saying here, that fundamentally architects, artists, environmental artists are really the makers of this next generation. It requires, we've had so many years of user interface designers and app designers working not just in 2D, but under this construct of app design that is now being shifted into more of an experiential realm, which is a very different skill set. It's a very different way of thinking about how people interact with technology and with a space that is so much closer to something like not just a building, but experience making in terms of like theater or museum design. Any time that you're talking about the choreography of people and emotions through a space is really where these virtual spaces start to shine. And that's the stuff that I get really excited about when I see it happen amongst our customers and the users of both the Wild and Iris. When you see these new ways of people looking at how a space can both live within the constructs of the physical world, but also blow those out of the water a few times and understand how you can surprise and delight people in all new ways when you're moving them through these environments.
Right. Now, COVID, of course, did quite a number to our cities as we needed to evacuate them during the pandemic year. There's been a lot of discussion about what's going to happen next, what I'm seeing with a lot of this technology from Kat's work, Andrew's work, the examples you've shown, Gabe, we have an opportunity to reimagine the workplace and to imagine virtual workplaces, places to meet and collaborate that can be anything we really want them to be, right? We can work in a world as beautiful as Apple's campus, which is really gorgeous, but very expensive to create. In the virtual world, there's no dollars attached other than the time you put into it. And you can get incredibly creative and create groundbreaking spaces that are like some of the spaces that Andrew showed that maybe communicate different kinds of messages about what you're in there for, right? So what do you think, Kat, is the next step for some of this in terms of where workplaces go?
Yeah, I definitely think I see it playing out in a blended format. Like, I think the success of mixed reality will really come when you have a mix of folks in a room and in VR and not feeling like one or the other is above in experience the one that you're not a part of. So I think also it's interesting to kind of discuss the role of the architect, because what we're finding in practice is that a lot of the environments that exist that are not necessarily designed by architects are great and do function in VR, but when you're trying to bring somebody brand new into VR, you almost have to blend the creative liberties that you would typically take as an environment designer for a game with the knowledge of how people approach a workplace and what they're already familiar with. And so the way that plays out sort of as an anecdotal story is we had a collection of designers at our firm reimagine what our Atlanta office would look like when it was entirely in VR. And so what's interesting is you tell a group of designers there's no limitations. You can do whatever you want. And at first that's a little overwhelming, and then it becomes exciting because if you want to meet outside, you don't have to worry about if it rains or not. If you want to be in the Atlanta office but on the Irish coast, you can do that. And so it was interesting to see them tackle what we keep and what we toss from the real world, and what culminated in that exercise was really an environment that took the best parts of workplace and combined them with some of the sort of out there ideologies of like a game or something that's entirely otherworldly. And so what we're finding is that though not every physical object that you bring into VR performs the same function, it usually goes a long way to telling people what types of behaviors to do in a particular space. So chairs are not entirely functional in VR because you're not really sitting in them, and in some cases people can get hurt thinking that they're really there. But they tell people where to go and where to stand and what type of environment they're stepping into. And so I think the role of the architect is going to be to sort of, it's not atypical with what we do every day, which is to take all of this information and sort of streamline it and make it work for the medium with which we're building in.
Andrew, what kinds of reactions do you get in your professional work with VR from your clients?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the tricky things about architecture as a discipline is that we do a lot less prototyping than other industries. And we often put something out into the world. It's actually, I'm obviously a practicing architect building a lot of stuff. And so I have to be a little careful to say this, but we put things out into the world sometimes that feel more like prototypes than products that are fully realized over an R&D and development cycle. If any of my clients are listening, I'm not talking about your project, obviously. So this is where any way that we can prototype the way other industries do is a huge boon to us. And so I think VR is one of those ways. As far as the way clients react and team members react, I mean, we're in a phase of this technology where people are just excited to be participating in it, and there's a seductive quality to the VR experience that is not is something to be wary of. The work needs to be good, right? And if the work is good and then it looks cool in VR, then you're doing everything right. If the work is not so good, but people are so psyched to be in the headset that they approve the work, that's not great. And I don't think that that's, in other words, there's a danger of the seductive qualities of the medium, the technology, and a client just saying, this is so cool, I'm so excited about this process, that maybe we don't really work the thing together as client and architect and team member as much as we should. So I'm very wary of that. I think that other modes of representation in the architectural space have that same consideration. I think that there are many gorgeous drawings of problematic buildings, and sometimes you look at a building and say, you know, this is maybe not so successful, but I can imagine this beautiful rendering of it. So anyway, I think that that's one way when your client is reacting very positively to the VR experience or other team members. It's important to push through the novelty to the work itself. So that's something that I like to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I was at MoMA decades ago now, and I was in front of a Mario Boda hand drawing. It was the biggest piece of element I'd ever seen in my life. And, the Swiss architect's work is beautiful from the outside as an object, and intriguing with materiality and so forth, and its engagement with the landscape and sites. But I don't think Boda buildings are necessarily that strong on the inside. And this is what you're getting at right now. And I think it's an important point, because this is where immersive technologies, especially in the academic situation or setting, can play a powerful role. Because, when I was in architecture school myself, or other students, they could have that really seductive, slick drawing that gets pinned up, and everything gets focused on that, and you're not really looking at the whole building as a balanced thing. And of course, we now live in a kind of performative age. We're looking at buildings to perform, not just with energy and daylighting, but a whole range of issues. And that's an area where I think immersive technologies probably has a lot of running room in front of it.
Yeah, I think so. And it can be problematic to kind of be seduced by the image, but I think conversely, sometimes the platonic ideal of the project is superior to what is finally built, and that can be due to many things that happen along the way. And so I think that there can sometimes be that Boda drawing as architecture versus however the building turned out has value in and of itself. And I think that's relevant to the idea that a work of virtual architecture as architecture rather than as a prototype. And I know I'm pointing out the value of the prototype, but I also, in my work, I'm very interested in the architecture is the thing that is in virtual space. It's not a prototype. It's fully realized in its final form, such as it can be final in a virtual form.
I think there's also an interesting point there in terms of the role that prototypes play in terms of rapid iteration, and just iteration, whether it's rapid or not. How do we iterate when designing environments? The speed of iteration is largely pulled down to project scale. So you have to see an idea become a built environment to iterate and then do your next project, which improves upon that built environment. Can we look toward not just prototyping, but iteration as a part of the design process at every phase to just increase the velocity of that improvement, so that it's happening not just at project scale, but on weekly or daily scale? We're taking something from idea to built environment, idea, built environment, idea, and in doing that, the ROI is not just gauged based on mitigating problems, but gauged based on actually finding better solutions. superior solutions, better designs, better emotional designs, better, more efficient designs. And that's what really excites me is thinking what that actually does to the design process itself.
Definitely. And I think it requires us almost letting go a little bit of the preciousness of visualization, which has been interesting to watch. I moved through it when I was a designer at my previous firm, but we're so used to creating the beautiful image, the beautiful walkthrough, the beautiful whatever it is. And I think prototyping in VR forces you to embrace that it might not be a finished thought, but it is ready to view because it conveys some very important information that might otherwise be lost in just a traditional perspective. So the technology is also catching up. I know the previous presentation featured a 3D scanned model, but what's exciting and the wild actually showed us you could do is, I mean, iPhones can 3D scan now, so there's nothing stopping someone from scanning a room, throwing it into VR, and starting to model directly over it. And so I think that, just to reiterate, that the preciousness, I think, just needs to be let go of in order for us to really acknowledge VR for the powerful iterative tool that it can be.
Right, and Kat, that's a good breaking point or break-off point for the discussion of AR, which we haven't quite touched on yet. But yes, Apple's phones and their iPad, the latest iPad, and what's coming in their newer versions of iOS, are increasing the capacity to basically scan with LiDAR, to basically use cameras and LiDAR to create very accurate models. And this I think this is a great thing because we can spend a lot of time making models in the process, in the design process. And as good as modeling tools are out there, it's still time consuming. And being able to scan things is a way to accelerate a lot of the workflows that we use. In terms of AR, Gabe, so I know the Wild utilizes some components of the AR process. Can you sort of give us a highlight of that, as well as where are we going with AR in the construction side? Because I think there are kind of two sides to this coin when we're talking about AEC immersive design. I think one is in the office or in your home or wherever you're working from, and then there's the real building out in the site. And I think AR is clearly going to prove itself as being the more important technology on the construction site.
Yeah. So there are you're hitting on a few different sides of augmented reality, which is a broad term, but to sort of like pinpoint them, number one, there's this idea of a digital twin, and how quickly can you create a virtualized model of a physical item, whether that's a building or whether it's a desk or a doll or whatever. And this is where this LiDAR scanning and the democratization of 3D scanning is really taking hold, that you can make this happen both quickly and cost effectively, and anyone can do it, on a tablet or a phone. So that process is really great for taking a physical item and bringing it into a virtual space. But the opposite is also very useful, which is I need to take something from the virtual space and embed it into the physical space. And that's really where augmented reality shines, is to say, I've got my building, I've got a lot that is empty, and I want to put that building onto the lot. I want to physically walk around the entire building. I want to walk through the building physically, in context, which is really the key point. And this is the real value that augmented reality creates on the construction site. Let's stop talking about something, about what it's supposed to be, and start just experiencing what it should be in conjunction with what is, in context. Turn all of those page turns of like, we're trying to find this exact part of the design into just like that. That's what it's supposed to be right there. And that reduction, that improvement of efficiency, not just of communication, but about mutually understanding what the problem is and what the solution is a game changer on the construction site, because people get frustrated, people even when you describe what it's supposed to be, people still misunderstand it. It's documented. People don't do it right. Anyone has, in the industry has experienced these issues, and this is really the promise that augmented reality holds to just improve that, honestly, by being able to show everyone on experiential terms the virtual idea in conjunction with the physical environment.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, what are your thoughts on AR's importance in the construction site domain?
I think what I'm most interested in there, or my mind goes to the kind of, the idea that we will augment ourselves as performers of various construction site tasks or other kinds of technical tasks in the environment. And so there's kind of, obviously there's building as object on the site, or then inhabiting that building on the site, and the value of that. I think we can also imagine this micro scale where a tech on the job site, he or she is augmenting their visual interface with AR technology, and they're receiving input on how to do a certain task. The old, not too long ago, the Vive, the Vive kind of introductory set of games software had a kind of an experience where you were working on a robot, and there was a VR. There was a set of people would be familiar with where it was walking you through these various tasks, and that's going to happen. And I think we need to be cognizant as human beings of what we cede to AI, what we cede to technology, where we are suddenly no more than a set of hands, and you're putting that jet engine together, and no human being really knows how to do it. And you're just a set of hands, and it's only AI that knows how to do it. Yuval Noah Harari looks at this a lot and talks about kind of how, as AI gets more powerful, human beings may become just a kind of dumb set of hands, really. And that is certainly a function of AR technology. So I don't mean to be the dystopian guy on this panel, but I guess that kind of micro scale tech on the job site augmenting their work process is something that we should be focused on. Not because it's going to, Skynet's going to become self-aware, but because it's
right. Well, as a counterpoint to the notion of the scariness of where AI can go, there's a wonderful podcast on AR on ARC Invest. They're a company that you may have heard of. Kathy Woods, the CEO. They invest in only disruptive technologies, and they share all their research, and it's a treasure trove of information for people who are interested in emerging technologies. And they recently interviewed Paul Travers, who's Gabe, you might know the name. He was CEO of a company called Forte Technologies in the 90s. They created the VFX1, a helmet-sized VR gear that initially was being tested, I believe, on U.S. Special Forces. And what the U.S. Special Forces guys told them, they said, look, this is really awesome, but it's very heavy. And then we have to carry these tough books around. They're also very heavy. What we really want is we want you to get all this technology inside a pair of Oakleys, because I guess they wear Oakleys. And so they called it Oakley Gate. And they said, if you can get through Oakley Gate, you can sell all of this technology to half the military. So Travers went about creating a company called Vuzix, VUZIX, dedicated to basically solving the Oakley Gate problem for a range of industries. Everything from warehouse logistics to telemedicine to field services. Ironically, it's not focused on AEC, at least not yet. But I think, this idea of when it becomes the new common sense to utilize these technologies over the old common sense way of doing something. That's, when half of everyone wants to do it, that's what he's all about in his company. And so one of the things that happened for them during the COVID year is doctors could not be exposed to potential COVID patients. So they started using this gear in large numbers so that one doctor can go around and visit patients, and other doctors can just be piped in because the gear has a 4K camera on the end of it. And so everything the doctor sees, everyone else could see. And when I think about technologies like that, Gabe, I think about what's possible on the construction site and how you could start to arm construction professionals and how they could have real-time communications like Zoom calls basically, or like a wild session where you can actually have this sort of remote servicing kind of field engagement. But more than that, you could begin to pipe a lot of field information out into the internet in a way where it can be organized for architecture students and interior architects so that they can actually get direct exposure, that precious direct exposure that exists on the construction site that is very hard to get. And I think that's important because as we keep increasing the technology threshold and degrees of requirements for professional AEC design, landscape, interior professionals, architects, it's getting ever increasingly difficult to find time to focus on how buildings are actually made. What do you think about, the potential, Gabe, for where AI can start to, service the industry in these broad brush kind of, Oakley Gate problems, that how do we solve big problems in AEC using this technology?
Yeah, well, one side of it, that you alluded to is, again, going back to the virtualization of transportation, allowing people, the right people at the right time, to be augmented into a physical environment. So you end up discovering that there's an issue that you need somebody to solve, like an engineer who did a design in an early phase, and you need their expertise on site. How quickly can you solve that? Do you have to put them on a plane and fly them to site? Do you have to take a bunch of pictures and then they don't get the right ones and then you have to take more? Or can you use augmented reality to literally virtualize them onto the site and allow you to share instantly, from wherever they are, share an experience and triage the problem and find a solution and move along. So that's one really core piece of it, is bringing the right people from wherever they are into the right place at the right time. The other thing has to do with augmenting the capabilities of the people who are there. And this is one thing for construction, but also this extends into ownership as well. Post-construction, how effectively can we see into the walls? Like how can I stand, in front of an HVAC unit and understand that there's this piping going back here that I can't physically get to effectively, but I can understand something that is potentially very complex and hard to physically access because it's behind a surface or in a confined space, and allow that human that's standing there to have all that information right there in context. And that is a tremendous superpower that we give to people on site through all of those phases of servicing a physical building. And then the last thing I would say is AI, what you were sort of getting into. What role does artificial intelligence play in this whole situation? And even to what Andrew was saying earlier about the dystopian future of artificial intelligence, how afraid do we need? What is AI, and what do I need to be worried about here? And to that end, I think there are a few facets here. Number one is to say that in the short term, I think that AI is really solving a lot of the challenge. It focuses on a lot of and solves a little of the mundane tasks in a way that humans just can't. You can hire a bunch of skilled professionals to to go through a bunch of iterations, like in the design phase, and like create those iterations, or you can have an AI generate 100 iterations for you, and it puts the human in the position of being a director rather than a laborer of to that end. And similarly, on the construction side, it's sort of the same thing. Even once you get into like robotics, actually building buildings, and AI powering those robotics that are building buildings and finding structural issues on the site. I think that it changes the role of the human in both of those cases, but in a way that I think we can roll with. Like, it's not a bad thing. It's okay. It's different, but it's foundationally making us better. It's making us more capable. It's augmenting some of the tasks so that we can focus on different tasks. And I think that that's what humanity has done for years. That's what we did with the automobile. That's what we did with, the PC, the phone. Like, it's advancing our capabilities and what we can do as a human on this earth. And there are incredible challenges to that, and there are dangers to that. And mishandled, we can make mistakes that are going to be incredibly problematic. But in and of itself, my view is that shouldn't stand in the way of human progress. Like, we need to move forward. As humans, we have to move forward. We have to innovate. We have to create, and we have to deal with the problems that we could create in that process. We have to do both. And, that is both the beauty of humanity and what we have done and what we will do in the future. And that is also our great struggle, is to balance those two things in the world at all points.
Right. Well said. What you're talking about too reminds me of something I heard in a conference in Japan. An American architect talked about low tech, low touch, high tech, high touch, almost like if you draw just a matrix and put those together. And what he was saying was that if we adopt technology, we can actually use it to free up time so that we can have a more high-touch connection to our clients. Yeah. And I think we've probably learned this better than ever in the last pandemic year, is that human connection is important. And I think one of the things that I see as a practicing architect is the difference between the landscape architect, the architect, and the interior professional. The interior professional has more touch time with the client generally, often, not always, but often. And the relationships can often be stronger. And I think what this architect was saying is that if you can adopt technology and in a way where you can increase your touch, basically where you can have more human contact with the client, you can actually build in value to your services that weren't there before, because you're getting to know the client at a higher level, but you're also in that process discovering deeper and more important issues that the client has. Is that something that sort of resonates with your work, Kat?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. Within the past 2 weeks, we actually had a team in our Dallas office bring a CEO of an organization into their space in the wild. And I think the feedback that we got from them was that they were really able to understand better what he was after in terms of the quality of the space or the type of finishes in the space. And so I think my point before of sort of taking interpretation out of the equation, I do feel like there is a closeness when you invite clients into their space. It almost becomes like an early access type of phenomenon where you're sort of peeking behind the curtain and seeing the in progress, but that not only allows us to better understand the client, but for the client to better understand the set of issues that we're up against when trying to solve any particular problem through design. So I do think that the technology has a huge potential to bring us closer. And anything that's experienced in VR is a lived experience. Fascinated by the neuroscience behind VR, but the early days studies really indicated that the memories you're taking when you're in VR, those are real memories. They're the same as if I were in the room with you. And so I think there's a tremendous amount of power in that, but there's also a lot at stake in that if you enter VR and you have a terrible experience, you're really not going to want to go back into VR without a lot of coaxing or a lot of convincing that things have changed. So I do think there's a lot of opportunity, but it has to sort of be carefully navigated intentionally.
Yeah, excellent. I know we have some questions in the audience, and I want to turn it over to that segment. I think I'll just read them. So Michael Keys has a question. One might argue that true architectural experience has to do with a tactile connection to it. Do we think VR XR will be better able to bridge this in the future? Who wants to take that?
I think that's me. I mean, I think I would love to hear that argument. I can imagine it, but one might argue that, but I'm not sure that I would. As far as if we broaden the system boundary of architecture to include the things we make as architects, that kind of platonic ideal of the building, the unbuilt work, the other things that we create, and that it's not just about the physical building. I think that this question of the tactile connection and with the loss of the physical building, it's sort of not architecture. I think that more than ever, and I know this is what Michael's reacting to. I think with virtual spaces, we have to embrace the idea that that we may interact with them in a more subtle way that is not physical. I think that there's a whole discussion of kind of haptics and feedback and hardware that enables us to experience more of the physical ideas of the virtual space, and that technology. In fact, Gabe might have a better sense for that. The runway on that technology, we seem to be a long way from viability, but much longer way from democratization of the kind of haptic suit where I can feel the architecture. But certainly those ideas, like the ideas of VR itself, have sort of been simmering for so long and so long. So as far as being able to bridge it in the future, I think so, but I would, as Michael sort of keeps it open, I wouldn't necessarily think that it's so important that we get physical kind of feedback from the architecture.
Mm-hmm. And those things are definitely underway. I remember trying, I believe at the time they were called Ultra Haptics, now they're called Ultra Leap. But a really amazing experience where you were casting spells, and through ultrasound, they were essentially simulating the feeling of heat on your hands as you navigated through it. And absolutely, it's not necessarily affordable to any person that wants to get into it, but I think that's sort of how most things begin. So I definitely see it being aspirational and something that, hopefully in 5 to 10 years, we'll be looking back being like, how did we ever do VR without engaging sound and scent and touch and all these other senses? I think there's also some cinematic experiences where I tried a Ghostbusters VR experience at Madame Tussauds with my old boss at my old firm. And what was cool is you move through a physically built space that is identical to the virtual space. And so I had almost become numb to the VR experiences of, this isn't really there, this isn't really there. And I reached out my hand and there was a pipe rail where the pipe rail was in VR. And so I think the notion of finding opportunity to surprise and delight, I think there's lots of space out there for folks to explore the convergence of both, but it's not necessarily something you do on every project quite yet. I'd love to see it get there.
I think the technology is getting there. There's a company in Finland called Vario who makes really a high-end industrial grade headset, and it's taken off in aerospace and military applications, but specifically aerospace, because training time in the simulators for commercial airline pilots is actually costly, because they have to fly to just a couple locations in the country, like Seattle being one of them. And the thought was, if they can create a basically equivalent training experience, that they could then have 100 or 200 locations across the country, or one in every major city, you can decrease cost. But one of the things that they have in their technology is that the ability to kind of combine physical, like a physical cockpit mock-up with the VR in kind of a seamless integration. And I don't know how that works for architecture yet, but I can see it working at some point. I can see companies beginning to branch off in those directions to kind of simulate, down to touch and scent and other senses. One thing to point out, and I'll read this next question. Someone is saying, Kyle Turno is saying, is this, or will these technologies be something smaller size firms can apply, or is the cost and net gain too high? Maybe Gabe, you want to touch on that a little bit.
Sure. So there are different sides to the idea of affordability. Well, number one, on the hardware side, I think the price point has been, or the barrier to entry is very, has fallen over the past few years substantially, to where now you can buy a consumer Quest for $299. That's really an excellent headset. It doesn't require a high-end computer to go along with it. And so just to get in on the hardware side, I believe is quite affordable. It's hard to argue against that. On the software side, there are a lot of free applications to get started. I think, the question of even affordability under like the software like the Wild and Iris VR, I would say, it's a higher price point to get started. Our pricing starts at $225 a month per seat. However, to be honest, I think the value that you get for that price point is substantial. If you can mitigate one issue early in a project that can have monumental consequences later in the project, you're going to pay that back almost immediately. We've had people in demos of the Wild discover massive issues with their design that they import, for their trial. And in the demo with our account exec, they identify an issue that could cost many tens of thousands of dollars to correct down the road. So the return on investment can be substantial in these softwares. And so it's worth noting that. It's worth noting the problems that we're trying to solve here, and that they're big problems. They have monumental impact, financial impact, that we're trying to solve through these softwares. I would say beyond that, and somebody asked even below about educational pricing, I believe. Yes. And we do offer educational pricing both on Iris VR and the Wild. You can contact us to learn more. It's not something, it's rolled out. It's not necessarily broadcast on our site, but it is something that we do. So feel free to contact us.
Yeah, that question was from Kathleen Fritz, who's assistant professor of interior design. Right, she was asking also about, first of all, she wanted to thank you, Kat, for your teacher-student perspective and how VR AR can help with students being able to visualize their designs. One of the things that I got out of Mary Oxman's talk today, which was fabulous, is she made the point about the impact of the Industrial Revolution as processes that we're still very much wedded to on some level, even though if you listen to someone like the economic historian Carlotta Perez, she'll tell you that we're in the fifth surge since the Industrial Revolution. We're in the ICT era. Before that, we are the mass manufacturing era, and before that, big engineering, and then rail, and then the original mills. But I think that what I got out of her point today was that architecture as a discipline, the AEC design fields as disciplines are actually still very tied to multiple 100-year-old processes, and they're very wedded to some assumptions. And one assumption is that you don't need to spend a lot of technology money to do what we do, and that made sense when we were working with analog tools, and the cost of expensive drafting tables and equipment and lighting and spaces were our big cost. But I think getting back to that point about a low tech, low touch, high tech, high touch, I think we need to reimagine the way we do allocate our cost in the industry so that we can economically analyze where the benefits are. Because you're right, Gabe, you can solve one problem that could be worth so much time and effort and expense and heartache by being able to get in a one-to-one relationship in your environment in a full virtualized setup. And I think that that thinking just needs to change, and I think it's a cultural shift that's going to take time, because we still have a generation of, a lot of firms out there are still owned by baby boomers and maybe old Gen X that are still thinking along the lines of the 20th century mode of operation, and that just isn't. All of this is not the new common sense way of doing something, which is a Perez phrase from her book, but the new way of doing things. That's what we're talking about now, and that's exciting. I think that's all of our questions. And does anyone want to make any closing comments or questions to each other?
I think I just want to mention that there's so many options out there if this is something that you're interested in learning. So particularly if you're a student on this call and you feel like you've been watching the jump rope spin, but you haven't been able to jump into VR, there's so many free options out there, both for modeling. Blender is an open source tool that's really incredible, that is free. There's open source VR platforms like Mozilla Hubs that you can jump into today for free. But it's just to reiterate, five years ago, I went to a hackathon, and that was my first foray into VR, and now I do it on a pretty much daily basis for a large firm. So it's just to say that there are infinite options out there to learn this stuff. If you're a BAC student, they have a tremendous amount of resources, but you don't necessarily need that to get started. Just start Googling, start YouTubing, and you'll find your way. But it's definitely where the industry is headed, so worth investing some time in learning, at least from my perspective.
I agree with that. We're definitely focused a lot on networked applications of the tech in this discussion today. But as far as kind of getting one's feet wet, and for students, and I'm an adjunct at the BAC as well, so there are it's a technology to get into just even natively, locally in your working environment with various applications that are not necessarily networked the way the Wild is or Mozilla Hubs. So the two are not the same. One does not need to be networked and collaborating in this space, although it's fabulous. Tools like the Wild that enable us to do that. So jump in as part of your own workflow locally, at your desk is what I recommend.
Yeah, I think we're at an inflection point. ARK Invest has estimated that at the end of this year, there'll be $1.2 billion in the immersive space spent, but by the end of 2030, it will jump to 130 billion. So we're looking at an industry that is going to explode, especially in the next, say, 5 to 10 years. In the next 1 to 5 years, I think, and Gabe, you can chime in on this, I think we're going to start to see AR glasses, the kind that will, like if we're talking about the Oakley Gate problem, the kind of glasses that you'll want to wear, and you won't feel like you're some kind of weird geek walking down the street. But before that, we're going to also see probably just an ever increasing adoption of more sophisticated VR headsets not just in the gaming space, but in the entertainment space and of course in industrial sectors.
Yeah, I just add that there's never been a better time to get started. It's worth just taking that first step, getting a headset, trying it, both for work and for play. There's a lot of fun to be had in virtual reality right now, and so just get going.
Yeah, I think both Gabe and Kat mentioned uses of the technology, sans headset, and most of the platforms we work with, you can inhabit your models and orbit around and just use your desktop as the viewer, and so even the headset is not an absolute requirement to entry.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for your participation in this fantastic chat, and thank you for the questions from the audience. I think Eliza now will maybe pop in and do what she needs to do, but I want to thank you again. Thanks, Gabe, for making the time to come talk to us in BAC Talks. Andrew, Kat, it's wonderful getting to know you and in your work. I look forward to seeing what you both do in the future.
Thank you, Anthony. Likewise. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.